Hello and welcome to the fourth session of the massively open online course on digital currencies for the University of Nicosia. This is Andreas Antonopoulos. This is our 8th run of the MOOC. More people than ever before. Great to see you on the YouTube channel. And thank you for providing some great questions throughout the week. Let me know if the quality of the video and audio sync is good. If not, let me know on the chat. Let's get started. First question comes from Anita. If someone steals my phone with my wallet tap, can he or she immediately spend my funds? It depends. If you have no protection to access the wallet tap or the phone itself, yes, they can. So on my phone, I have my phone is encrypted. I have a PIN for turning on my phone, which is long and complex. And my wallet app has another PIN. So even if my phone was unlocked because I was just recently using it or something like that, if you try to open the wallet app, it will ask for another PIN, and you can't get through that screen to even see what my balance is, or certainly you can't spend funds. So it's probably a good idea, whatever wallet you have, to activate the PIN feature if it has one. If it doesn't, probably not a good choice of wallet. Anita follows up with some more questions. Is the only option to back up the wallet app and write the seed on a sheet of paper? That is the best way to back up your wallet app application, is to write your mnemonic phrase on a sheet of paper. And is the seed the only thing I need to recover my wallet and funds? Yes, the backup phrase or mnemonic phrase, which isn't exactly the seed, but it's derived from the seed. That's the only thing you need to recover your wallet, to recover your funds, to recover the history of all of the transactions that have happened. Although in many cases, the wallet also allows you to store metadata. So for example, you can type a description or label into your transaction so you can remember what they were about. And that information is not stored on the blockchain. So unless you also have some other way of backing up the wallet, you may lose that metadata, but you will not lose access to your funds or the transaction history. Anita asks, if I sell my smartphone and uninstall the wallet app, is the information gone, or can someone find my private keys? That depends on the wallet, so it's probably not a good idea to uninstall the wallet app. Instead, before selling your smartphone, any smartphone, under any circumstances, what you should be doing is a full factory reset of that phone in order to completely wipe all of the storage, including the encrypted storage and all of the key stores and backup data. And finally, Anita asks, when will the secure use of Bitcoin be so convenient and user-friendly that all people can use it? And I'll answer your question, Anita, by flipping it around and say, when all people can use Bitcoin, that's when we know that Bitcoin's security is convenient and user-friendly. Until then, we don't. Marco says, in the interview we saw from Eric from Ledger Hardware Wallet, he stated that the software used is not open source. If the software is not open source, how can I be sure that the private keys used are really random and not only looking random? Marco, you can't be sure. But the truth is, you can't be sure even if the software is open source, because you don't know what the hardware is doing. So you can't be sure that the private keys generated by any hardware device haven't been tampered with. The only thing you can go on is the reputation and the supply chain of that wallet. So it's important to be very careful where you buy wallets from. It is relatively easy to introduce hardware or to create a replica of a wallet that has special hardware in it that generates keys that are not secure. And you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, frankly, unless you're a hardware expert. And even if you are a hardware expert, sometimes it's very difficult to see what's being replaced in there. So there is an element of trust around reputation for hardware wallets. and you are shifting your trust slightly to the hardware wallet manufacturer. And then you've also got to check and make sure you understand how that wallet gets from the hardware manufacturer to you. So if it comes, for example, through a source like, let's say, a third party selling it on eBay or Amazon, you have no way of knowing if it's been intercepted en route. I prefer to buy my hardware wallets in person from the manufacturer if I can. Obviously, that's not possible for everyone. Sergio says, I'm using an exchange which claims to have a multi-signature wallet. This means that the exchange cannot spend coins without the client's key. Even if the exchange is compromised and the exchange's key is stolen, the client will not lose his coins since the second key is in possession of the client. Well, yes, Sergio, if that depends on how many keys there are. If there are 3 keys and it takes 2 to sign, then the client has 1, the exchange has 1, and some third party has a 3rd key. Then the exchange can work with the third party to do transactions without the client's approval. So that would be a 2 of 3 multi-sig scheme, and that doesn't give you the guarantees you're looking for. And are you really sure that you are in possession of a key? Or is your browser client in possession of that key? And how easy is it to steal that key or hijack your browser session? So it depends how you're storing the key as to whether you really have that extra security. Generally speaking, most exchanges don't do this because then in order to trade, it requires you to be online and available to sign with the key. So you can't place, for example, limit orders or things like that. You can't easily do withdrawals or deposits without being online. So most exchanges don't really do this, but I'd be interested in hearing more about what you've done there. Ramesh says, I created a blockchain info wallet, but didn't get the public and private keys. Is there a way I can generate or see the private and public keys? I don't know. I don't know how blockchain.info constructs their wallets nowadays. From what I understand, they are hierarchical deterministic wallets, in which case there should be a seed, which you should be able to back up in the form of a mnemonic phrase. Having a mnemonic phrase is equivalent to having the private public keys because you can generate all the private public keys from that mnemonic phrase. In fact, it's better because you have the entire sequence. Audrey asks, do wallets automatically generate a new address per transaction? If yes, is it possible for Bitcoin to host several transactions to one wallet? Yes, so wallets generate a new address per transaction. Most wallets do that. It's a best practice in the industry. It's how it should be done, and that affords you better privacy and security. But your wallet has, usually wallets that do this, have a seed, and that seed is used to derive a whole tree, a sequence essentially, of private keys and public keys that correspond to them. So your wallet can manage thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of private keys, each of which has its own public key and its own address. So it can keep changing all of these, and yet your wallet sees that balance as controllable. So it sees that as your balance, even if you have several different keys and addresses managed by that wallet. Ahmed asks, are faucets secure to share a wallet address on those sites? Yes, you can put your Bitcoin address anywhere and not worry too much about it, because Bitcoin addresses are intended to be public, and they represent the double hash of your public key. And someone having your address, they can do 2 things. They can send you money, and they can see what other transactions are occurring with that address. So if you take an address from your wallet and you put it on a faucet, you're going to receive a small amount of Bitcoin. That's what a faucet is intended to do. But of course, that also means that anyone who has access to that faucet can also see all of the other transactions you've received at that address. And perhaps if you used your name when you registered for the faucet, or your email address, or a cookie or something else, so you were logged into another site. Now the faucet also knows that address belongs to someone identified by a specific email or other identifier from your browsing session. So you are revealing some information. Keep in mind, faucets are not a very good way to get Bitcoin. Generally speaking, the amount of Bitcoin they send you is so small that it's unspendable, meaning that the fees to spend that particular input are greater than the value of the input itself. So faucets are not really useful. The only place where faucets are useful is testnet, so you can get test coins to play around. But on mainnet, Bitcoin faucets are not used anymore, not usable anymore. Ahmed also says, I came across the advice, back up your wallets regularly following the 3-2-1 rule. 3 copies, 2 mediums, 1 offsite. What does that mean? 3-2-1 is a rule that comes from information security and for preservation of backups. It means that you should have 3 different copies of your material, maybe the material you're trying to preserve. In this case, that would be your mnemonic phrase or your private key. But for simplicity, let's assume you have a sophisticated, modern, hierarchical, deterministic wallet. So what you're backing up is the mnemonic phrase, the 12 to 24 words. You should make 3 copies of those words. They should be on at least 2 mediums. 3 mediums is also possible. So for example, if you store 1 copy on a USB drive and you store another copy, you should store that second copy on paper, and maybe a third copy you should stamp into a steel plate or something like that. You can use different media, but the idea is don't put, for example, all your backups on USB drives, because different media for storage have different life cycle and time between failures. So for example, a USB flash drive, yeah, that data may not last as long as you expect. CD-ROM may last longer, and paper probably lasts the most, but it's also a case that the things that may affect paper don't affect the other media. So for example, water will damage paper, but it won't damage a CD-ROM. So by differentiating your mediums, you have the best chance. And finally, the 1 rule, which is 1 offsite. So remember, it's 3-2-1, 3 copies, 2 media, 1 offsite, meaning that you should have at least 1 of these copies at a different location from the location you customarily reside in or use that wallet. If all of your backups are in the same place, one disaster in that location causes a problem. Now, what does different area mean? Preferably, it means geographically separated by a large enough distance. So you can't say, well, I'll put 1 copy of the key in my living room and the other one I'll bury in my backyard, because your backyard is still way too close to the living room. So if there's a sinkhole and the entire house disappears into it, or there's an earthquake or a fire or a flood, both of those locations could be damaged. Instead, think about separating your offsite location by at least 100 miles, preferably more, so that you have some geographical separation. Larissa asks, is it possible that 2 wallets generate the same private key? And if so, would they generate the same public key and addresses? Let's start from the second question, Larissa. Yes, if 2 wallets generated the same private key, that would result in the same public key and the same address. So any private key corresponds to 1 and only 1 public key, and that any public key corresponds to 1 and only 1 address. There's a little quirk there, which is that you could express public keys as compressed or uncompressed, and depending on the format, that will generate a different address. But let's assume that nowadays everybody uses compressed public keys, so 1 private key equals 1 public key equals 1 address. It's a one-way relationship. So if you had 2 wallets generating the same private key, they would generate the same public key and address. Now let's look at what scenarios might occur whereby 2 wallets generate the same private key. So the first scenario is the private key should be generated from a source of randomness. So picking random numbers. And these random numbers are in the range between 1 and approximately 2 to the power of 256, slightly short of that, but for simplicity purposes, let's say that's the number. So it's a 256-bit number. That's equivalent to a number between 1 and 10 followed by 77 zeros. That's how big this number is. So if you were picking random numbers in that range, and you were picking a trillion numbers per second, it would take you a billion trillion years to pick the same number twice. So we're talking about unfathomably large address space. There is no chance you are going to randomly, if you are truly using a random number generator, if you're truly using entropy, and then the chances of picking the same private key are basically 0 for all practical purposes. Theoretically not 0, but practically 0. However, what if the randomness is broken? Let's say you use a wallet, and that wallet has encoded within it one of the sources of randomness is to go to a website. And let's say that there's an error, and that website returns HTTP error 404. And for whatever reason, your wallet doesn't check to see if it got a random number, and instead just takes that HTTP error 404 and uses that as its source of randomness. Well, it's going to generate a private key. Now imagine somebody else is using that same wallet, gets the same 404 result, generates a private key. That's the same private key. And it's because the randomness wasn't random. What was assumed to be random was, in fact, an error message. And this scenario is not theoretical. This is exactly what happened to one of the wallet manufacturers. It was a very, very bad bug. And it led to basically people having the same address, hundreds of people having the same address. And then they'd see money show up in that address, and they'd spend it even though it wasn't theirs. And so people lost some money from that. Pritam asks, I tried registering with Coinbase to buy Bitcoin, but on their site you have to register with many personal questions. How does this protect my privacy if in the future I want to make some transaction using the exchange's wallet? If you're using a wallet that belongs to an exchange where you do not control the keys, and that wallet is connected to your identity through a series of personal questions, you have no privacy. In fact, I can guarantee you that most of the exchanges you interact with are sending records of the personally identifiable information together with all of the Bitcoin addresses related to your wallet to third parties who are applying what are known as know your customer and anti-money laundering regulations. Basically, there is comprehensive surveillance on all transactions originating out of and towards exchanges. And these analytics companies, they have a record of everybody's Bitcoin address in these exchanges, and they can relate it to specific people, and that's how they violate the privacy of Bitcoin. If you use Bitcoin through a third party, you're not using Bitcoin. You're using a traditional banking system that happens to run with Bitcoin in the back end. Let's go over to, let's see, first of all, I think I saw there were a couple of follow-up questions. Patrick asks, is it true that if you lose your two-factor authentication codes when losing or selling your phone, you can't access your wallet anymore? In most cases, no. Wallets do not have, if a wallet has two-factor authentication, that is usually something provided by the wallet provider. And if you have your seed, your backup mnemonic phrase, it does not depend on any two-factor authentication codes. It does potentially depend on a passphrase that you can add optionally. And if you lose that, you're in trouble. But two-factor authentication, PIN codes, and things like that do not affect the seed. Giovanni asks, private keys are impossible to memorize. Is there any possibility to have a kind of DNS mapping, a private key to something more readable for humans? I assume you mean public keys or addresses here. A lot of companies have tried to make a DNS-like mapping between names and Bitcoin addresses. The problem with all of those services, just as the problem with DNS, is that they are centralized. As a result, they are subject to both surveillance and censorship. So if you put your name next to a Bitcoin address in one of these services, now everybody knows, everybody who can hack, everybody who can subpoena that service can know which addresses belong to you, and also can prevent you from having a name by censoring your transactions, by censoring your participation in this DNS mapping scheme. I should be more specific. Brian asks, how does OpenDime verify private key security? Not quite sure what you mean there. OpenDime generates keys on the device using a random number generator, and those keys never leave the device unless you break the seal. Eamon asks, if Bitcoin's future depends on Bitcoin Core, doesn't that make them essential authority for control and logic of Bitcoin? No, not really. Anyone can participate in the software development for Bitcoin, and anyone can choose to run or not run the software produced by Bitcoin Core or any other development team. And if Bitcoin Core was no longer developing Bitcoin software, somebody else would be developing Bitcoin software in a different team, and you could run that. And no one can force you to run the software that Bitcoin Core produces. We'll cover this more in the next session. The Duchess asks, I read recently that well-secured wallets have been hacked. The private keys were retrieved using computing power and BTC were taken from those wallets. What impact on BTC security moving forward? I do not believe what you have read is accurate. I have not heard of any well-secured wallet be compromised through computation to retrieve the private keys, brute forcing the private keys. Yes, you can break security at many different layers, which is why when using a wallet, you have to have layered security. So if I have a wallet on my phone or my desktop, and that wallet holds keys, and my desktop is compromised, then my wallet's compromised. If my smartphone is compromised, then my wallet is compromised. If I have it in cold storage and the physical device in cold storage is compromised, then my wallet's compromised. If I have a passphrase, however, that I have to type in every time, that's two factors, so that makes it more difficult. If the physical device is secured by a PIN, that's another factor of authentication that makes it more difficult to hack, and so on and so forth. You don't rely on any one security tool to protect your funds. You rely on layers and layers and layers of security. All right, let's check in with the chat. How's everyone doing over there? Let's see some interesting quotes there. G. Villiker says, PIN numbers are easy to crack. Not so much. Depends how they're implemented. If they're implemented well, they're not easy at all to crack. I use a device called a Trezor, for example, and you'll see this on a number of other devices. The Ledger hardware wallet does the same, as do many other hardware wallets, where if I enter the PIN incorrectly the first time, it will delay and ask me to enter it again after 2 seconds. Then the second time, it will be after 4 seconds. The third time will be after 8 seconds. 10 times incorrect password, I'm already looking at several dozen minutes to an hour, and then I'm looking at hours. If you keep doing that, by the time you get to 100 wrong pins, you're looking at millions of years between attempts. So PIN numbers can be implemented very securely, whereby it's impossible to guess, because the number of guesses you can actually try in the period of time you can try them is not sufficient to explore even a small fraction of the PIN number space. So for example, I use these hardware wallets. Let's say I have a PIN that's 8 digits long, or 10 digits long. So that's a that's a pretty big number. So 10 billion combinations, or 100 billion combinations. And if you have that many combinations and you can only try 3 before the number of times is exceeded, that's a pretty secure PIN. Yanakis asks, since a full client is able to verify transactions, is it a full node? Does it have to be online at all times or frequently? Does it verify other transactions other than mine? A full client verifies all transactions that occur on the blockchain. So what do we mean when we say full client? And unfortunately, that terminology gets a bit hazier as the options expand. You can have a fully validating node. And a fully validating node is a node that receives all transactions and blocks and authoritatively and completely validates all of them without reference to any other authority. That's a fully validating node. Now, a fully validating node may also maintain a full copy of the blockchain, so it's fully indexed, fully validating node, or it might be a pruned, fully validated node, in which case it's validating everything, but once it's validated everything, it discards old transactions to limit its blockchain use of the hard drive. So that's the types of full nodes that exist are varied. If you have a fully validating client, does it have to be online at all times or frequently? Frequently would be enough. I mean, you can resync it at any point in time. Obviously, that takes some time. You could have a node that's offline, and you just put it online once a month, resync the blockchain, validate the transaction, and then disconnect. You can do that. One of the characteristics of Bitcoin and the mechanism as described by Satoshi Nakamoto in the white paper is that clients can leave the network and rejoin the network at any time and be able to resynchronize and independently validate. So you don't have to be online at all times, but it does help so you can be able to validate immediately rather than waiting until you resynchronize. And also, online doesn't mean the ability to transmit. With space-based broadcast of blockchain data from the Bitcoin blockchain, you could just have a client that listens on a satellite dish, and that's its only connection. So it's not really online, but it's receiving blocks and transactions. And does a full node also verify other transactions other than mine? Yes, your full node validates everything. It validates every transaction, every block, whether generated locally or received from somewhere else. Albert asks, how secure is a hardware wallet without a full node client? It's less secure than a hardware wallet with a full node client, but it's more secure than a full node client without a hardware wallet. Does that make sense? So how secure is a hardware wallet without a full node client? One of the problems you have there is the question, how secure? We don't have a unit of measurement for security. Security is a risk-reward trade-off. So how secure is it? What do I say? 6.3 McAfees. That's how secure it is. That doesn't mean anything. There's no metric we can use for absolute measure of security. We can only judge relative security, and we can judge security relative also to the value that it's protecting. A hardware wallet without a full node client is less secure than a hardware wallet with a full node client, but is more secure than a full node client without a hardware wallet that's storing keys online, I would say. And so you have to decide what you need for your security. Austin asks, what are the criteria of a good Bitcoin client? That depends on what you're trying to achieve for yourself. I would describe it this way. How do you know what the criteria are for a good car? Well, it depends. Where are you driving? How many people are you driving? How often do you carry stuff? What kind of stuff do you carry? How much of it do you carry? What's your fuel budget? What's your economy considerations? Who's driving it? How many people are driving it? I can't tell you what are the criteria for a good car because that depends on what you want to do with it. I use Bitcoin wallets very differently than other people use Bitcoin wallets. So I'm looking for advanced features. I care about whether my wallet protects my privacy, whether it reuses addresses, whether it implements various protocols such as payment channels, reusable payment codes, whether I can set custom fees by setting a Satoshi per byte fee level, whether I can choose to run my wallet over Tor, whether I can choose the routing infrastructure underneath, how well it can protect my information, whether it has good PIN security. All of those considerations come into consideration when I'm using a Bitcoin wallet. I'll tell you a couple of things that I think are important, though. I think it's important that whatever Bitcoin client you use, you control the keys. And you know you control the keys when you have the ability to restore that client, online, offline, using a tool, whatever, to another wallet that is from a different vendor. So you control the keys, and you can use those keys to reconstruct your wallet. That's one of the criteria. The second criterion is that it has good security around it. So what is good security? Again, that depends on how much you're going to store. I would like to see at least a PIN feature so that you can't actually access the wallet or send payments unless you've entered the PIN. And then finally, it has to be understandable. You have to be able to use it. So ease of use is really important, especially for new users. And I would make different decisions for a new user than a more advanced user. Cold storage. What is a physical Bitcoin as a method of cold storage? And a physical Bitcoin is really ill-defined because there aren't any standards for physical Bitcoin. There are a couple of physical devices for carrying Bitcoin keys, and these can vary. One example is Cassius coins, which are the typical gold Bitcoin coin with a big B on it, but they have a hologram-covered section where there is a private key, and that private key contains some actual Bitcoin. So that's basically exactly the same as a paper wallet. It's a physical recording of a single private key. Another form of physical Bitcoin is the OpenDime Bitcoin stick. And that essentially gives you the ability to have a stick that can be read by USB, and you can see how much balance is on there, but you don't reveal the private key until you break the seal on the stick, and then you can redeem it and spend it. Otherwise, you just pass the USB around as if it's a coin. And that depends. Again, the security of that depends. You can have paper wallets, which is another way of doing it. You can have paper backups. All of those are physical storage media for Bitcoin. Edwin asks, given the number of Bitcoins that are not in circulation, where are these stored? Are these held in cold storage? There's absolutely no way to know that, Edwin. No way to really know where or how different people store their Bitcoin. They might be in cold storage. They might be in warm storage. They might be sitting on an online service like an exchange. All right, let's look again at the chat and see if we have some new exciting questions from the audience. Anita asks, has every feature in Nakamoto's paper found its way to the Bitcoin blockchain? Has everything been implemented as they proposed? Mostly, yeah. The things that were in the paper, yes, have been implemented. I think everything that was discussed in the paper has been implemented. Some of the features written in the original code in the client implementation were disabled. And the reason they were disabled is because they posed some rather complex security problems and were dangerous. So those were disabled. Some of those have not been re-enabled. So some of the opcodes that exist in the Bitcoin scripting language that Nakamoto introduced, these were not in the white paper, but they were in the code. Those were turned off. transaction replacement in the mempool using sequence numbers, that pretty much got replaced. You know, a number of different features have been tweaked since then, but there are no, I don't think, any features that were in the paper that we haven't seen implemented. Bitcoin has progressed significantly from that time and has a lot of things added afterwards that were not in the original white paper. James asks, why is reusing addresses less secure? Two reasons, James. One, when you reuse an address, you create a trail that can reduce your privacy. So it affects your privacy because people can see previous transactions you've made, and they can associate payments made with that address previously with payments made now, so they can see two different payments you've made. And again, that reduces your privacy. But why is it less secure? Well, when you sign with a private key and produce a signature, you then present to the Bitcoin blockchain both the signature and the public key. There is a possibility in the future that a public key may be broken, and that may lead to reversing the public key into a private key. This is still a theoretical possibility. It's way into the future, has to do with quantum computing. But what happens if you would do that? Well, if you never reuse addresses, then the only time the public key and is seen is when you've already spent money from that address. Since you're not going to reuse it, it will never have a balance again. So even if you could reverse that shortly after the transaction happened, as long as that transaction confirms first, then it will spend all of the money behind that address. Then there's nothing to steal if you could even. The same thing applies to signatures. There are certain circumstances under which a signature may contain a bug, and this bug may reveal the private key, and that's when a poorly initialized random number is used for the signature itself. This has happened a few times, and of course, if you reuse that address, anybody scanning the Bitcoin blockchain for that presence of an insufficiently random component in the signature would be able to reverse the private key and spend your money. So just in general, because we don't know, one security layer is never enough. So layer the security. Yes, private keys and signatures protect your Bitcoin. But how about we keep moving it so that even if that protection is weakened in the future, there's no value left there, so that we're one step ahead. Alex asks, what is my opinion on mobile software wallets like Bread Wallet? I believe that for the vast majority of people, especially newbies, the most secure device they own is a smartphone. The smartphones generally, if properly updated, are more secure than the average desktop. And as a result, I prefer to see mobile software. Many mobile devices have secure enclaves, trusted platform modules, and other hardware devices that can be used for key storage and the storage of sensitive data. They have built-in encryption. They have all kinds of things like that. If your mobile wallet is properly configured, if your mobile software is properly configured, if your mobile operating system is properly updated, it's probably the most secure device you own. So therefore, very suitable for non-security experts. But again, mobile wallets are also easy to use. The interfaces are much more intuitive, and smartphones are the right device to use for this. So also good for newbies and non-security experts. There's a number of them: Bread Wallet, Mycelium, Samurai, Copay, Jax, and many, many others. All of these are good. The question is which is best, and that depends on what you're trying to achieve. Amelia says, can you explain more about the difference between Bitcoin address and public key? The address and the private key can be changed every transaction, or just the address? Okay, 3 different numbers. 1, your private key. This is the source. This is a random number. It's a long random number. That's the private key. The private key is used with the elliptic curve to produce a public key. And the public key is another number. It's composed actually of x, y coordinates on the elliptic curve, but it's another number. And that number is related to the private key, derived from the private key. There's only one public key that corresponds to that private key again. But you can go from the private to the public, but you can't go from the public to the private. You can also verify signatures produced from the private key by using the public key to verify it without revealing the private key. That's the useful capability. And then the public key is hashed twice to produce an address. And an address is what you actually make a payment to. So you make a payment to an address. Behind that address is one and only one public key. Behind that public key is one and only one private key, which gives you control over the money stored in the address, which is 2 steps away. Every wallet that generates a new address, it generates a new private key from which it generates a new unique public key from which it generates a new unique address. So in order to have a wallet that produces a different address for every transaction and a different address for change, it must be able to produce different private keys underneath all of those. So it produces a unique private key for every transaction. From that private key, those private keys, it generates a series of public keys, again, one per private key, and then addresses. Patrick says, how do exchanges secure your Bitcoins by using cold storage? Well, what they do is they keep 90 to 95% of their funds offline. As a result, they have to have enough money online to handle the total net difference between withdrawals and deposits every day so that they can make withdrawals when requested. But they don't have to keep the rest of it online. They can just keep an entry in the database that tells them who's trading what and what their balances are. That's not secure, of course, because they have custody of all of the Bitcoin, but it's more secure than keeping all those Bitcoin keys online. Daniel says, the blockchain is getting bigger and bigger. At a certain point, only few nodes will be able to store the entire blockchain. What is the solution for that problem? The problem, Daniel, isn't storage, it's bandwidth. The total amount of storage, disk drives are growing faster. The problem is the bandwidth, which comes in 2 places. First, if you do the initial blockchain download, or IBD, the initial blockchain download, where you download from the Genesis block from January 2009 all the way up to today, well, if that's a very big blockchain, that's going to take a lot of bandwidth and a lot of time to validate, to bootstrap a new node. And then you have to be able to keep up with the bandwidth that's produced every day from blocks and transactions. The idea is that the block size and blockchain size in general is kept constrained through the 1 megabyte block limit and the 4 megabyte block weight limit introduced by SegWit, so that technology in hard drives and bandwidth and other infrastructure improvements move faster than the size of the blockchain. That's the idea. We'll see how it works out. Stuart asks, how do you secure complete randomness of generating keys? Well, that depends on the environment and how you're generating the keys, but you can go as simple as flipping a coin 256 times, writing 0 if it's heads, 1 if it's tails, and producing 256 values, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, etc. for 256 coin tosses. That's a private key. That's pretty random. That's very random. If the coin is properly balanced and you throw it the same way, then you will produce a good result. Another way to do it is to get dice and roll dice. And you can roll 4 dice at the same time with values 1 through 6, just normal dice, and then you can convert the 1 to 6 number into a base 6 number that's sufficiently long to produce a key. You can also use a random source such as cosmic radiation or another randomness source that is in hardware. So a lot of hardware wallets use various tricks in order to generate randomness, such as, for example, generating noise through a gate, or looking for thermal noise on a capacitance sensor, such as you see on tokens, or using some other technique like that. I've seen people go as far as, and I have used this myself, using a Geiger counter to measure cosmic radiation at a resolution that produces continuous random signal. So you can go as far as you want in terms of generating secure keys. It's best not to try that unless you're a cryptographer and you know what you're doing. The best way to generate secure random keys is to use a wallet that's well written in hardware or software, and have it do it for you. George asks, so the public key is obscured by hashing and can only be determined valid by the private key during the signature process. Is this correct? Not quite. George, the public key is obscured by hashing. And in order to confirm that the money you're trying to spend is spendable by that public key, you have to show it. So when you spend in a transaction, you submit your public key. That public key is then double hashed by everyone who's validating the transaction, and they'll compare it to the address, the double hashed public key that was presented earlier, and say, oh yeah, this is the public key. If you double hash it, it does produce the same address. So you have to reveal your public key when you're spending from an address, which is why we try not to reuse them. The signature, which is produced from the private key, together with the public key plus signature can verify that not only you own the public key that our address corresponds to, but that you have the means to sign with the private key, because that signature corresponds to the public key, or the signature plus the public key can form a calculation that validates that you have the private key. Stuart says, how do I check my wallet is using the best random source? Well, one very simple test is to produce a wallet, and then reset and produce another wallet, and then reset and produce another wallet, and then reset and produce another wallet. And in each instance, look at the first address and see if it's the same. That won't tell you if your wallet is using the best random source. However, if you see the same address, that will tell you that your wallet is using no random source. So it's impossible to actually measure quality randomness, but you can measure bad randomness. If it produces the same address, that's bad. So my wallet is the best random source is not a statement that can be verified scientifically. But checking that your wallet is not repeating the same numbers and therefore producing the same addresses, that is something you can verify. So just produce 2 keys. All right, let's see what else we have from the logs, from the chat. Come on, everybody. Last push, last question of the day. Make it your absolute best. Looking at the chat here. Who determines the algorithm for checksum hashing and address creation? That's part of the address, the standard for the address. It's in one of the Bitcoin improvement proposals that define Bitcoin addresses. Yanis asks, are the ICOs safe to go with or not? That is out of topic for today's course, but I will answer with not. And then move on from that. We'll cover that in a future topic. All right, I think we've covered everything that was in the questions. And with that, thank you all. This was session 4 for the massive open online course for digital currencies for the University of Nicosia. This is our 8th iteration of the MOOC. I'm Andreas Antonopoulos. I've been answering your questions for the Bitcoin Basics Part 1. Next week, Bitcoin Basics Part 2, we'll talk about more about wallets and exchanges and other things like that. Look at the material, pose your questions, have a conversation online, bring me the best questions possible, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much for attending today.